This is a little over an hour.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings. Good to see you here. Thank you for coming out. I'd like to begin with very warm thanks to Brian. Brian, where are you? There he is back there. Brian has done a lot to make this happen. Also, thanks to Anna for that generous introduction. And I'd say we should also give a round of applause to the staff of this museum, which keeps America's maritime heritage alive. Now, I'm very happy to have a chance to talk with you this evening about a part of that maritime heritage which is not always included in Americans' history of the seas. I want to talk to you about this book that I've written, The Amistad Rebellion. And I want to begin just by reminding everybody what happened in that story, okay? Just let me summarize what happened. The year is 1839, and this slave schooner, La Amistad, which in Spanish means friendship, kind of a cruel name for a slave ship, I think, contains 53 enslaved Africans, 49 of them men and 4 of them children, including 3 little girls. They are being carried from Havana to another part of Cuba where the sugar plantation system is just exploding. Sugar is a key to Cuba as one of the most dynamic slave societies in the world. So they're on their way on a coastal voyage of only about 300 miles. During that voyage, a revolt at sea takes place. The Amistad Africans rise up. They kill a member of the crew of the Amistad, and then they kill the captain, a man named Ramon Ferrer. They take control of the ship with the idea of sailing back to their African homeland, which is Sierra Leone. They all come from southern Sierra Leone. They keep 2 of the Cubans alive. These were actually their so-called owners, Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes. It turns out Montes had been a ship captain, so he knew navigation. And they told him, sail toward the rising sun, because the rising sun had been at their backs when they made the Middle Passage across the Atlantic in the first place. Well, Montes was a very clever man. During the day, he did sail to the east as he was instructed, but he kept the sails loose and flapping in the wind so as not to make too much progress. And then at night, he reversed course and headed back towards the Caribbean and the North American coast in the hope that he would be discovered, that they would be captured, and that he and his fellow Cuban slave owner would be saved. So he tricked the Amistad Africans. Eventually, they saw that lacking food and water, they were not going to be able to make a long voyage. And so it was asked by Montes, do you want me to take you to a free country? And they said, what free country is this? That free country is the United States. Well, we're talking about one of the leading slave societies in the world in 1839. Not exactly a free country. But to make a long story short, the Africans actually sailed the vessel all the way up to the northern end of Long Island, where they were taken by a U.S. Navy ship, carried to New London, Connecticut, and thrown in jail, charged with murder and piracy. Now, as soon as word got out that these Africans had come ashore, abolitionists from up and down the eastern coast flocked to the jail to try to assist them, thinking that this cause might help them to advance their struggle against the institution of slavery. Well, a long legal battle took place. For 19 months, the Amistad Africans were in jail. They did receive support from no less a person than John Quincy Adams, the former president, at that time congressman, who represented the 36 survivors before the United States Supreme Court and won a dramatic victory, declaring them illegally enslaved and therefore free, and enabling them to return to their native land, which they did 8 months later. In November 1841, they returned to southern Sierra Leone, taking with them a group of missionaries, and this then is the origin of the American Missionary Association, who would then create something called the Mende Mission. Here we have an image of the ship itself, the Amistad, and the moment that it depicts is the meeting with a group of white hunters on that northern end of Long Island. You can actually see them here. Yes? This is the Amistad, and in the background, this is the naval vessel, the U.S. brig Washington, that is on the way to capture them. This was probably produced by an abolitionist artist sometime after the actual voyage. So what we have here is a very important case in the struggle against slavery, important because it was a victory. This kind of thing was not common. The institution of slavery was extremely strong. Abolitionists and enslaved Africans won a very significant victory in this case. Okay, so this subject has been much studied, and it's been well studied. So you may be wondering, why write a new book about it? Well, my interest in this particular case grew out of the previous book that I wrote, entitled The Slave Ship, A Human History. This was published in 2007. This was a pretty gruesome subject to study, I want to tell you. Very painful to see what was done to so many millions of Africans in the pursuit of profits. The terror that was crucial to the management of people on board these vessels. I really had to live with this for several years while writing this book. And as I studied the slave ship, what I found was that there were a great many rebellions that rose up under the most extreme circumstances. It was really quite inspiring to see that the enslaved people kept fighting back no matter what, even when they had almost no chance of success. Many rebellions, very few successful rebellions. So in the back of my mind is the Amistad case. Why was this one successful? I really wanted to know. This was an extraordinary counterpoint to a gruesome history. And it captured my imagination. So I began to read all of the work about the Amistad. One of hundreds of slave revolts on board ships, but one of the very few that actually achieved victory. And what I found bothered me in this sense. There was very good scholarship on the case, but it was almost all about the legal struggle. Very few people had actually studied the revolt. Very few people had actually wondered why it was successful in the first place. So it seemed to me that something important had been lost. It also seemed to me that in the process, the real heroes of the case, by that I mean the Africans who risked their lives to gain freedom, had been pushed aside, and that politicians and judges and abolitionists had become the main players in the story. John Quincy Adams, featured here, is, I think, a kind of iconic hero of the Amistad case. And I must tell you, he played an extremely important role. But nothing happened without the actions of this man and those other 52 Africans on board that vessel. Theirs was the action that set everything else in motion. So I wanted to return to that. And I also wanted to question what had seemed to me to become one of the main arguments about the Amistad case, and that was that it was a great success story about the American legal system. The fact that the Supreme Court could rule in their favor proved that the American legal system was the hero of the case alongside John Quincy Adams. To which I ask, do you mean the same legal system that was holding 2.5 million people in bondage at that moment? That's the hero of the story? I don't think so. I think we have to go back and look at the rebellion itself, and especially to look at those Africans who made the rebellion. So what we have in both history and film is actually very good history from above. History that stresses the likes of John Quincy Adams. But what I wanted to do was to write a different kind of history, what Anna called history from below. Whose history is it? Whose rebellion was it? And what does it mean to us now? Those are questions I wanted to pose. Well, in the course of doing this research, I must tell you, this project was full of surprises. It's a story that everybody thinks they know, and I thought that I probably knew it too, but it turns out there were so many surprises. This actually put me in mind of a phrase formed by a very eminent American historian, Lawrence Levine, in which he talked about the unpredictable past. It's a great phrase, the unpredictable past. What I found was that the past of the Amistad was extremely unpredictable. And so what I'd like to share with you today are some of those surprises. What were the surprises of doing this kind of research? The first surprise, and in some ways the biggest surprise, and the one that made many subsequent surprises possible, has to do with the sources. The quantity and the quality of evidence about these Africans who made the revolt. Now, I had spent 30 years studying sailors, enslaved Africans, pirates, poor people who left almost no documents of their own. So I was trained to do this kind of work, to try to write history from below. People who had been really left out of most of the historical narratives. But I must tell you that the body of evidence available about this case, I'm convinced, is the richest and the deepest of any I have ever seen about any group of enslaved rebels anywhere. It is a staggering body of evidence. Let me give you a few examples. When I came to study the rebellion itself, I wondered, are there first-person accounts of it? Well, it turns out there are more than 70 first-person accounts of it, told by 17 different people who saw it. 2 sailors, the 2 Cuban slaveholders, 1 Afro-Cuban sailor, and 12 of the Amistad Africans. Their version of what happened in that rebellion, and some of them told it more than once, and told it at varying lengths. 70 accounts of the rebellion. This is extraordinary. But an even bigger key is this. The Amistad Africans were held in jail, mostly in New Haven, Connecticut, for 19 months. And during those 19 months, all kinds of people came into the jail to see them. Now you have to know, jails in 1839 were not like jails today. They were much more open institutions. And the jailer, his main objective in all this is to make money. So guess what he did? He charged admission. People lined up in the thousands to pay admission and walk through the New Haven jail and to see or to talk with the Amistad Africans. They found translators. They found 2 African sailors who could translate back and forth. More about that in a moment. But these people who came into the jail did remarkable things. Some of them drew portraits. These were sketched by a 17-year-old artist named William Townsend. These are 2 of the very important players in all this. This man here, Grabot, was probably the second most important figure among the Amistad Africans, second only to Cinque as a leader. He was a very important figure in his native society in West Africa. And here is one of the children, a little girl named Margru. She was about 9 years old. She too is going to play a very significant role in this entire case. And more about that in a moment as well. So, artists draw their pictures. Correspondents conduct interviews. People write about the Amistad Africans in letters. People publish articles about the Amistad Africans in their newspapers. What this means is that there are a great many very detailed sources about who these people were and what their lives were like. And now let me just mention 2 other sets of sources which I found, which proved to be especially important. I found a series of letters written by the teacher of the Amistad Africans. One of the things that happened was that the jail became a schoolroom. And people learned. They learned English, they learned arithmetic, they studied Christianity. This was very important to the abolitionists, that they be taught the rudiments of Christianity. So this teacher, a young man named Samuel Booth, he was actually an undergraduate student at Yale University. He spent many hours each day with the Amistad Africans, and in the period running up to their moment of departure to go back to Africa, he starts talking to them intensively about where they lived and who they were and what their lives were like back in Africa. Because that information was going to be crucial to getting them back home. And he wrote a series of letters about this. Some of them published in very small abolitionist publications. But they're full of rich detail about the African lives of these people. That's one very important set of sources. And then there was another. And this, you have to say, is the scholar's dream. We spend, folks, a lot of time showing up in archives and looking for this source and that source and being told, oh, well, that wing burned down in 1916 and we don't have those sources anymore. Sorry, that's all gone. Well, in 1852, 13 years after the rebellion, a young woman named Hannah Moore went from the United States to work in the Mende Mission in Sierra Leone. And at a holiday dinner where there were still, I think, maybe 4 or 5 of the Amistad veterans living at the mission, she asked them to tell their story of the uprising. And then she wrote it all down. So she transcribed their oral history of the rebellion, how they had committed it to their own memory. This is a stunning source, and it contains information that no other source of the time period has. For example, about what was the debate down in the hold of the Amistad when they're trying to decide whether to rise up and seize the ship or not. The oral history contained information about that discussion. That's really getting close to the source. And there you actually hear the voices of the people who made the history. So my point is, there is a huge amount of evidence for history from below, so much so that it's possible actually to get to know these people as individuals. you can hear them speaking. You can get a sense of their sense of humor. It's a really intimate body of sources. That's the first surprise. The second surprise it's not really a surprise, but the fact that we could study it is a surprise, is the utter centrality of Africa to this entire story. I wanted to pose the question, what is the big story here? Not just what happened in that courtroom, what's the big story? Well, guess what? The big story is a story about slavery and freedom. And it begins in southern Sierra Leone. And my account begins by asking a very simple question. Who were these people? Who were those people who made that revolt? What were their lives like before they were enslaved? Who were they? Well, they were, first of all, a motley crew of at least 10 different West African ethnicities or nationalities. They spoke probably 15 different languages among themselves. The largest group among them was called the Mende. And this, in fact, is the largest kind of culture group in southern Sierra Leone. About 2/3 of the Amistad Africans were Mende. And then there were 3 or 4 of other groups, including the Temne, the Kono, Bullum, and then 1 or 2 people from other groups. These are basically the main culture groups of southern Sierra Leone. But one thing I noticed is that they had an unusual capacity to communicate with each other. Slave traders would frequently mix the ethnicities and nationalities of the people, the human cargo, so as to prevent their cooperation. That didn't happen in this instance, because many people could speak Mende and many of the non-Mende could also speak Mende. So there is that, and there's the multilingual reality in which many of these people can speak 3, 4, and 5 languages. So they were in a position to communicate with each other. This is a very important fact about making a revolt on a slave ship. I'll just give you an idea of where they came from. You'll see we've got Senegal and Gambia here. This is Freetown, where the British had set up their own colony of sorts. Here's the American colony of Liberia, where some people of African descent were being repatriated. And here is what's called the Galenas Coast. Okay? Lomboko was the name of the slave trading fortress where the Amistad Africans were shipped out. Here are the Mende further in, the Bullum closer to the coast, the Kono are up here, the Vai here. But this basically is the region where almost all of them came from. Now, what kind of experiences did they have? Well, it turns out that one of the most important things that all of the men, all 49 of the men, had in common was that they were trained warriors. It turns out that southern Sierra Leone in the 1830s was racked by warfare, primarily because this group called the Vai, in tandem with southern slave traders, Spanish slave traders in this region, had gone into the interior making war and capturing people to bring them back to the coast to sell, to be transported to places like Cuba and Brazil especially. So understanding that these people were warriors helps you to see why they might have been successful in carrying off this rebellion. That actually proves to be a very important fact. This is an image of a Temne warrior from the same period. It says a warrior with poisoned arrows. I show you this image because the man around his neck has what's called a gree-gree bag. This is something that warriors in southern Sierra Leone frequently wore. It contained spiritually charged substances that would protect the warrior in battle. And just to give you an example of how this operated, one eyewitness said that Cinque walked into court one day with a snuff box on a ribbon around his neck. Now that person had no idea what he was looking at. He didn't know that this was the protective power of a warrior. But that's the way it played out. Now, for the Mende, the weapon of choice was not the bow and arrow, it was the cutlass. Mende warriors fought mostly with knives. So guess what they found on board the Amistad? They found a box of machetes or cane knives. This must have seemed like a gift from the ancestors. Mende warriors are given knives. Guess how they found them? It's always been one of the minor mysteries of the Amistad case. It turns out the 3 little girls who were not chained and not fettered and had free movement around the ship found the box of machetes and told the men where they were. So those little girls played a very important role in the successful revolt. Now, going back to West Africa for a moment. Something that I learned about as I think being especially important was this. I wanted to know what were the experiences of self-organization that the people on the Amistad would have had. What were their models of self-organization? What kinds of organization had they known in their native societies? Well, it turns out there's one in particular that was especially important. It was something called the Poro Society. This is an all-male secret society. There's an equivalent for women called the Sande Society. It's very prominent among the Mende, but it's also prominent among the Temne, the Kono. All of the groups of southern Sierra Leone have their own Poro Society. And what the Poro Society does is fundamental to the way in which those societies operate. The Poro Society trains warriors. The Poro Society creates social discipline and deals with disputes. The Poro Society deals with witchcraft. The Poro Society declares war. And they actually have a word or 2 words for the goal of the Poro Society in the way that it operates in these African societies. Its goal was to create Noyela, which literally means, translated, one word, meaning unity. Everybody agrees one word. We are unified in purpose. Everybody is doing the same thing. There's that creation of social discipline. Well, I read a lot about Mende Society and the other societies of this region. I learned a lot about the Poro, but I came up against a real dilemma. And the dilemma is anyone who is initiated into the Poro is charged on pain of death. You must never reveal any of the secrets of its lore. So how am I going to prove the importance of the Poro Society as a means of self-organization if nobody is ever going to mention it? Now, I was sure that in the hold of the Amistad, what you had basically was a displaced Poro Society meeting. And they're deciding whether to declare war and seize that vessel. But I couldn't prove it. For the longest time, I couldn't prove it. But then I finally found 2 pieces of evidence which convinced me that it really was a Poro meeting. The first of these was actually written by a missionary when they returned back to southern Sierra Leone. This was kind of a moment of truth, because the Africans were going ashore and there were many of their own people, Mende, Kono, and others, there to greet them. And what the Amistad Africans began to do was to shed their Western clothing. Now, this really upset the missionaries. This was the reversion to heathenism. This was the reversion to barbarism. This was licentiousness. This was awful. But it turns out that even they recognized something else was going on. They didn't take off those clothes simply to defy the missionaries. They did it in order to show everybody their country marks, the ritual scarifications that they had, which showed which ethnic national group they were a member of. This was very important when you come back to Sierra Leone. So what they were showing were their Poro marks. The Poro Society presided over this scarification. And suddenly at that moment, the missionaries began for the first time to understand the importance of African cultural forms. And one of them wrote, you know, these marks that they have, they're very important to them. They're very proud of them. They're badges of honor. They're part of their identity. Well, yes, no kidding. Yes, that's exactly who they were. And finally they saw it. So you could see the role of the Poro in people's identity at this crucial moment. And then came the second piece of evidence. In that oral history that's talking about the debate in the hold of the Amistad, one of the people there said, I think it was Cinque, he's not named, who is for war? Well, it turns out 4 of the men were not for war. So a debate broke out. And then an elder, and this is another part of West African society, the elder is a very important figure. An old man called Lubo stood up and basically addressed those 4 men and said that they were very likely to die. Do you want to die an honorable death fighting for freedom? And they said yes, they would. And at that point, the oral history says, we had one word. One word, and that one word was war. So they even used the English translation of Noyela, one word. So again, you see the Poro Society operating in the hold of the vessel. Okay, so this is a very important part of the African side of the story. The other thing that I thought was especially crucial was what happened in jail. Now, our emphasis on the courtroom not only blinded us to some extent to the rebellion, it also blinded us to what was happening in jail for 19 months. And what was happening in jail was that you had African rebels and American abolitionists meeting face to face and trying to figure out how to cooperate. This is a very important moment. I don't think anything quite like this had ever happened before. So they have to build an alliance if they are going to effectively fight the institution of slavery. Well, what I identified as the crucial process among the Amistad Africans was basically to go back to something that is frequently discussed in the slave trade, and I talked about this quite a bit in my book on the slave ship. Anthropologists have come up with this term called fictive kinship, meaning people who are not really related to each other create relationships of kin and then act as if they are really related to people. This was going on those slave ships. Old kinship systems had been shattered. They are creatively trying to build something new. This began at Fort Lomboko. This continued on the first slave ship called the Tesora. This continued in Cuba. This continued on the Amistad, and this continued in jail. And one of the most impressive things you will see is the way in which this group of multi-ethnic Africans hold themselves together as a group. Unified. Always pushing for their single objective, which is, they said it repeatedly, we want to go home. Their idea of freedom was to resume the lives they had in Sierra Leone before their enslavement. And then, about a year into their jail experience, something new happened. And I thought this was remarkable too. They came up with a new name for themselves, these Africans. They began to call themselves the Mende people. Now, they weren't all Mende, but they had heard people saying in jail, there's this powerful sovereign force called the American people, right? That's the source of all power in this republic, the American people. They said, oh, okay, you're the American people, we're the Mende people. We're equals. American people, Mende people. And they used this phrase, the Mende people, to make their political demands and even to instruct John Quincy Adams about what he was supposed to say to the great court when it came time for them to hear their case. So, my point here, and this is the second big surprise, is that the African side of the story really matters in terms of how the rebellion happened and how these people organized themselves in jail. Makes a huge difference. The third surprise. The third surprise is basically this. Nothing that I read about the Amistad case prepared me to understand how tremendously popular it was. Now, I've already mentioned those groups of people lining up and going through the jail, right? Paying admission. Thousands, you know, folks, tens of thousands of people did that. 4,000 people alone on the first day they were in New Haven jail. 4,000 people filed through there. It's extraordinary. But look what happened. Artists come in. Okay, you saw some sketches. One man came in and took castings and then created 29 life-size wax figures of the Amistad Africans and assembled them at the moment of rebellion and then charged admission for people to come see it. Another artist drew a panorama painting that was 135 feet long. Folks, that's more than twice as long as the Amistad itself was. And he would roll it up into a giant canvas and carry it around and unroll it and charge admission. But it shows how fascinated people were in this case. They wanted to know everything about it. Now, this is all in the context of a northern society that historians have now discovered was quite racist. There were violent mob attacks on free black communities. There were violent mob attacks on the homes of abolitionists. There were violent mob attacks on interracial churches. So this popularity is remarkable alongside these other things that are very common in the 1830s. Well, one of the most remarkable aspects of this popular interest was that a newspaper called the New York Sun, this was a penny press paper, took a tremendous interest in this case. Now, the penny press, you would need to know, was a new kind of newspaper meant for a broader part of the population. The old commercial newspapers, they were more expensive, and they were usually bought by upper artisans, merchants, middle-class people, people involved in commerce. But the penny press was basically for working people, especially in New York. So the editor of the New York Sun sends not only correspondence to New London and then New Haven, he also sent artists. And I want to show you what one of them produced. Now this is an amazing image. Here is Cinque in the pose of a heroic Roman conqueror, with his machete in his hand. He's like an avenger of justice, is he not? Now you've got to put this in the context of most of the graphic representations of people of African descent in this period were racist in the extreme. So this is a very different kind of image. First time I saw it, I thought, my goodness, there must have been some kind of underground radical abolitionist group. Nope, it's the New York Sun. Why did they do it? Because they thought they would make money selling this image, and guess what? They did. They printed and reprinted these images of Cinque because people couldn't get enough of them. And alongside this, their reporters are writing accounts of the rebellion that are very, very favorable. Very positive, you might even say romantic. Some of the earliest accounts of Cinque are very elaborate descriptions of what a hero he is. This is really unusual. So my point here is that the Amistad Africans captured the imagination of popular culture in a way that made their case extremely unusual. The degree of popular interest in the case, I argue in this book, had an impact on the legal decisions taken, because at every step of the way, nobody thought they were going to win any of these legal decisions. And every judge who ruled in their favor acknowledged the extraordinary popular interest in the case. How could they avoid it? Because every time the Amistad Africans came to trial, the courtroom was, as one man put it, crowded to suffocation. There were so many people packed into that courtroom that no one would leave during break for fear of losing their seat. So the popularity of the case, I think, was very important to its outcome. Finally, the biggest surprise of all. The biggest surprise of all is just how wildly improbable the whole thing is. I mean, think about it. This motley crew of 53 Africans, somewhere in the northern Caribbean, draw upon their warrior skills and their Poro society background to launch a rebellion, and they seize their ship. Okay? That's remarkable in its own right. But the really wild part of it is, over the next 2 years, that action they took will cause the most powerful people in the world to debate the meaning of what they had done. The Queen of Spain, the British Parliament, 2 United States presidents, Supreme Court justices, the American Congress, the Queen of England, they are all paying close attention to this debate. What do we do about these Africans who have taken courage in hand and seized their own freedom? Well, their self-emancipation, I want to suggest, had a lot of ripple effects around the Atlantic, in Europe, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in America, especially in America, where it had the impact of radicalizing the abolitionist movement. And by that I mean that more and more people began to recognize that the resistance of enslaved people was crucial to abolition. They began, during the time of the Amistad Rebellion, to quote a famous line from Lord Byron. This is repeated again and again and again, running all the way up to the Civil War. And that line was, "Those who would be free must themselves strike the first blow." In other words, action from below can be a trigger. This had a very dramatic impact on a lot of leading African American intellectuals like Henry Highland Garnet, Frederick Douglass, and it had a big effect on a man named John Brown, who wanted to strike the first blow at Harper's Ferry. So I guess this is the final thought I would leave you with. One of the most remarkable things about movements from below is that they are unpredictable. You never know when they're going to arise or how. These things that rise up, these demands for justice, these demands for equality, these demands for freedom, they're unpredictable, and in their unpredictability, I think they are also a great source of hope. Thank you very much. We have time for questions, and I hope you'll have some. We would like for you to speak into the microphone if possible.
During the discussion, you talked about roaming around under the decks. I always was led to believe that as slaves were brought onto the ships, they were shackled and stayed shackled until they got to the New World. Was this different, or did they get free somehow, or do we know?
Yes, it's a good question. The standard practice on slave ships was for the men to be shackled, but not the women or children, unless the women engaged in resistance, in which case they would be shackled like the men, and many did. But they were not usually shackled to a particular place. In other words, 2 men would be shackled at the wrist and at the ankle, and then if they were going to move, they had to coordinate their movements in order to get, for example, to what they called the necessary tubs on the lower deck. That's one reason why you had to be able to move around. They also had to be able to come up and below. Now, the Amistad Africans were chained, and they were chained together in a large number. So, one of the questions has always been, how did they manage to get out of their chains? Well, I'll tell you a fact about who they were as Africans. 2 of them were blacksmiths. That will help. If you are trying to get out of chains, to have 2 blacksmiths who are there. So basically they managed to break a central padlock to free themselves, and that's what enabled them to come up onto the main deck and to begin the rebellion. But you're right, it's a very good question about how did people actually get free in order to wage an uprising.
Hi, I'm fascinated by this idea of action from below serving as a trigger, and I'm curious if you could discuss why you think the Amistad Rebellion captured the American imagination in a popular way when rebellions on plantations captured the American imagination in a negative way.
That's a good question. Did everybody hear it? Why was the Amistad Rebellion able to capture the imagination when, for example, Nat Turner's rebellion did not? Okay, there were no positive depictions of Nat Turner in the media as far as I can tell or anyone else can tell. Okay, here's something about the Amistad case that made it safer for popular support. First of all, they were not African American slaves. They were Africans. Okay, that mattered. Secondly, the slave owners were not American slave owners like John C. Calhoun or others. They were Cuban slaveholders. So that made it easier to vilify the Cuban slaveholders. Okay, so it's a little bit different. So it's a little bit safer. But I would emphasize that is not an easy distinction to maintain. In other words, I have never read about any American slave owner who would have liked to see an image like that. You don't glorify and lionize slave rebels. And actually the Spanish government pointed this out very clearly to the Americans. They say, yeah, so you're going to say that it's legal for these people to kill a white man, a figure of authority, and capture a ship? All of the slaves of America will be very interested to get this news. Okay? So there are contradictions there, but I do believe the fact that it came from outside the United States into the United States made it a little easier. But the other thing which I think really does matter is that this was a really very dramatic event. And what has struck me about the popular side of it is that they were interested in who these people were as Africans, and there was some kind of exoticism in that. I mean, many people in Connecticut had never really seen Africans before. So that was part of it. But on the other hand, the rebellion itself was the thing they really wanted to know about. That's why the paintings, we have this. Okay, this is actually an engraving done by a Connecticut artist. It's kind of contradictory and interesting, isn't it? Because here here's Antonio, the Afro-Cuban cabin boy. Here's the captain being killed by 4 men, and actually that was accurate. It was 4 warriors who surrounded him and killed him. Here's the ship's cook, Celestino, who's already dead. Here is Jose Ruiz. You know, this is all done by people who had been in the jail and knew who these Africans were, so you can actually tell that's Cinque right there. We can recognize him. That's definitely him. This is a man named Grabo. That's not Grabo, I'm sorry, that is Conoma. So the fact that you could kind of get close to the rebellion, I think, was very exciting to people. One thing I didn't mention is that 6 days after the Amistad Africans came ashore in New London, Connecticut, a play was being performed in New York about their uprising. Only took 6 days, and it was a hit. It was a hit in a theater that had a very large working class audience, a black and white working class audience, the Bowery Theater. I estimated that thousands of people saw that play, and they learned about the rebellion that way. And in that play, Cinque is depicted as a hero. So all these things are kind of counterintuitive, aren't they? We don't, that's part of why this project was so surprising. I did not expect to see this level of not only popular interest, but a sympathy in it. A lot of people went to the jail and say, I hate the abolitionists, but I really support those Africans. Those abolitionists are dangerous extremists. But we support these people. We want those people to be free. So it's interesting that it expands the ideas of anti-slavery beyond the abolitionist community. Yes?
Yes, what happened to the slave owners after they came ashore?
Yes, the slave owners came ashore, and what was very interesting is that their demands were quite simple. Give us our slaves back. But there was a question raised from the very beginning that these slaves were not legal slaves because Spain had signed a treaty with Great Britain promising not to import any new slaves after 1835. So the Cuban slave owners had very cleverly given the Amistad Africans Spanish names to try to represent them as having been already acculturated and on the island. Well, that everybody could see was false because they didn't understand a word of Spanish. It was interesting to see. But the slaveholders stayed in Connecticut trying for a while to get their property back, their human property. And then something dramatic happened. Lewis Tappan, a leading abolitionist, once they found translators and the Africans could tell their side of the story, Lewis Tappan arranged to charge both of the slave owners with violent assault based on beatings they had given these illegally enslaved people on board the ship. So they both got slapped in jail. Well, this is a pretty dramatic moment, and especially in the South, because they said, well, what happens to a Southern master who goes north with his slaves? Are you going to slap us in jail? That's exactly what Tappan wanted to do. Slap him in jail. That's also why there was a bounty on Lewis Tappan's head in the South. He was much reviled. They eventually gave up and went home to Cuba, is the short answer. But they waged a battle, and the Queen of Spain carried on requesting reimbursement for these slaves all the way up through the Civil War. Yes?
What was the length of time from the time of the rebellion until they docked in New York? And also, is that the first time that anyone who wasn't on board the ship was aware of the situation?
Yes, good question. The rebellion took place, and they were at sea for about 7 weeks before they got to the upper end of Long Island. Now, we know from the accounts of the voyage that they stopped 30 times. Mostly to get water. They didn't have enough water. We also know that Montez, the slave owner and the one who knew navigation, wanted to take them to Charleston, South Carolina. It would have been a different outcome if they'd gone to Charleston. But here's something that's kind of revealing. when the Amistad Africans saw, and I'll go back to this early image which depicts it. You see over here, when they came ashore, they were hungry, they were thirsty, but when they saw these white men who were hunters, they didn't ask for food, they didn't ask for water. The first thing they said was, and this was one man who could speak a few words of English, he said, "Is this slavery country?" So it's an interesting kind of political idea that some parts of this world were slavery country and some parts weren't. Had they gone ashore and asked that question in South Carolina? I don't know. I don't have evidence to prove that they did. They might have. But basically they had an idea that they had to get to a place that wasn't slavery country in order to have a chance to be free. And I think they were right about that. So I think this is a very important fact about why they eventually won. The fact that they were able to sail that ship about 1,400 miles far enough north. And when the man told them, he said, yes, he said, this is not slavery country. This is a free country. Slavery was abolished in New York. And they cheered and they exulted and they were thrilled and happy, and so much so they scared the white hunters who went and got their guns. They said, no, we're just happy. So it was really literally the case that they worked their way to freedom by sailing that ship and getting to a place where they had a chance to win freedom. But see, after that, then what matters is the alliance they build with the abolitionists while they're in jail. Yes?
Yes, is there a kind of a media backlash amongst the southern states trying to promote their own ideas and seeing the popularity of the Amistad in the north? And does this lead to a political ramification where they're really pointing to the north and saying, see, they're not on our side, they're not like us, and leading even more towards the rebellion?
Yes, no, it's a very good point, and it is certainly true that the southern newspapers are very, very voluble, very angry, and demanding, literally from the very beginning, that these Africans be taken back to Cuba immediately. They are unequivocally slave property. They must be sent back. Now, what's interesting about the media backlash is that it turns out the other major penny press newspaper, the New York Morning Herald, published in New York just like the New York Sun, is rabidly pro-slavery. So they also send correspondence, and so you'll frequently find the New York Sun correspondents and the New York Morning Herald correspondents writing about the same events in radically different ways. The New York Morning Herald is absolutely appalled by the popular interest in this case. They are actually worse than appalled. They are infuriated. And they just scream bloody murder. Those people that you are touting are just cold-blooded murderers. So there's a big kind of fierce debate. And of course, the fact that the debate goes on makes everybody else more interested in the case.
Yes, sir. During the 19 months that they were jailed, how were the three little girls cared for? Was there any special attention given to them in your research?
Yes. Okay, I'm so glad you asked this question because I wanted to go back and show you what a difference history from below makes to the story. Okay, remember Professor Gibbs counting from 1 to 10? I found a story in the newspaper about 5 days after they had moved to New Haven where one man says, the three little girls were teaching several gentlemen how to count from 1 to 10 in their native language. So the best idea the professor he got from the three little girls, okay? So they were in an unusual position, and they were actually the source of considerable conflict between the Amistad Africans and the jailer, because what the jailer did was remove the three little girls to become his personal servants in his household. And I can tell you that Cinque and the other Amistad men didn't like it one bit. Partly because it separated their collective. They wanted to keep everybody together, but there was nothing that they could really do about it because the jailer had power over them while they were in jail. Well, eventually they began to complain because the three little girls were not learning to speak English as well as the little boy who was their counterpoint, a little boy named Kale. And they were blaming then the jailer for not contributing to their education. Whereupon the jailer and his wife made several racist comments about, why would you want to try to educate these monkeys anyway? So this became kind of part of the tension, but the little girls were put into a different category, and then there was later on a very big battle over who should be their proper, who should be in charge of their lives, basically. And they removed, legally, the Amistad Africans and the abolitionists removed them from the household of the jailer, and they then began to live with one of the abolitionists close to the Africans themselves. The question was, did they also go back to Sierra Leone? Yes, they did. And all three of the little girls actually remained with the mission for many years. And Margru, right there, Margru actually came back to the United States and became, I do believe, the first black female graduate of Oberlin College. And then went back to Sierra Leone as a missionary herself. Most of the adult men were able to find their families and, actually did what they wanted to do when they went back. They wanted to go back to their lives. There is a tragic counterpoint for Cinque, however, because when he got back to his village, searching for his wife and 3 children, he discovered that the village had been completely destroyed in the warfare that continued after his own enslavement. So it is true that the larger reality of war and slave trade was beyond his ability to control it. Even though he did win one great victory, he lost his family.
Yes, hello. I had a question about the missionaries. We talk about how missionaries teach Africans whether or not they embrace Christianity or not. And I was interested in how well did the missionaries think they had succeeded in converting these Africans, and in what ways did the Africans use the teachings to further their own end?
Yes. Good question. Thank you. I think the missionaries, including the most religious of the abolitionists, such as Lewis Tappan, were properly realistic in saying that they knew that the Amistad Africans were willing to study Christianity, but they did not think that they had embraced it as belief. Maybe a few had, they hoped. But it turns out this is a really interesting and complex question, because clearly the Amistad Africans recognized what was important to the abolitionists. And so their attitude was, you want us to study your language and your religion, we'll do it. But at the same time, we're going to insist on our own identity as the Mende people. So you could say that their African identity grew as a counterpoint to this idea that they should become civilized, pious Christians. Now, all of these tensions were on display because once the Supreme Court ruled in their favor and said they could go home, well, the Supreme Court also ruled that the United States government had no responsibility to pay for their going home, so how were they going to get home? Well, for the longest time, people believed that Lewis Tappan and some other wealthy abolitionists simply paid for this, but in fact what happened was the abolitionists, with the cooperation of the Amistad Africans, organized a big tour up and down the eastern seaboard in which the Amistad Africans would go and speak and perform their knowledge of Christianity, perform their knowledge of English, perform their civilization And at the same time, they would insist on singing their native African songs. The African side was always there. And here's the wildest part of it all. The main event in every one of these performances, and they are all, by the way, performed before packed houses. I mean, the common comment on these meetings, we couldn't get everybody in who wanted to see them. I mean, we're talking sometimes about churches that would hold 2,000 and 3,000 people. The highlight of every event was when Cinque rose to take the floor to tell the story and literally to act out the rebellion, and he spoke only Mende. This was the way they were going to do it. And I can't tell you the number of people who comment. They say, he is one of the most powerful orators we have ever seen, even though we couldn't understand a word he was saying. But in not understanding what he was saying, a different point was being made. We are Mende people. This is our language. We will speak in our language. This is our story. And that's what Cinque did. At every one of these meetings, he told his story in Mende. So it's a fascinating thing to see how this matter of the kind of Christian identity and the African identity are linked.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. Just like to invite you back for a reception here, and Mr. Rediker will be back to answer any further questions or sign books. Thank you very again.